Hello, everyone, and welcome to this legendary lecture. In any discussion of undiscovered places, almost certainly the first name to come to mind is that of Atlantis, the so-called lost continent. Yet, by any rational standards, the Atlantis legend is one of the world's tallest tales. In this lecture, I will discuss a wide range of topics regarding Atlantis. First off, a basic description of the legendary island. Then we'll move on to Atlantis in literature and pop culture, followed by Plato, who is the only primary source of Atlantis. And then we'll end off the lecture with the question, where is Atlantis? And we will explore some theories on that. Before we begin, let me first explain the word legend. Legend is a semi-true story which has been passed on from person to person and has important meaning or symbolism for the culture in which it originates. A legend usually includes an element of truth or is based on historic but with mythical qualities. So basically this means legend falls somewhere between mythology and history. It's a traditional story regarded as historical but not authenticated. It's basically a historical epic Hollywood movie that takes some creative liberty, like whatever this trash was. And that's basically what a legend is. Now that we understand that, let's dive into the legend of Atlantis. Now, what is Atlantis? The founders of Atlantis were said to be half god and half human, so demigods. And they created a utopian civilization and became a great naval power. Their home was made up of concentric islands separated by wide moats and linked by a canal that penetrated to the center. The lush islands contained gold, silver, and other precious metals and supported an abundance of rare exotic wildlife. It was protected by the god Poseidon, who made his son Atlas, not to be confused with the Titan Atlas, king and namesake of the island and the ocean that surrounded it. As the Atlanteans grew powerful, their ethics declined. Their armies eventually conquered Africa as far as Egypt and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia in Etruscan Italy, before being driven back by an Athenian-led alliance. Later, by way of divine punishment, the island was beset by earthquakes and floods and sank into a muddy sea. Now, that is the most famous version of the legendary continent that everyone knows. Now, let's see what effect pop culture has had on us with Atlantis. I grew up with El Dorado being branded in my mind through the pop culture film The Road to El Dorado by DreamWorks. And on the other side of the animation genre, you have Disney, who created their own legendary continent city film, Atlantis the Lost Empire. And it is considered the most famous version of Atlantis in pop culture. And it's a 2001 animated science fiction action adventure film about linguist Milo Thatch, who believes he has a map to the lost city of Atlantis. Now, we all know Disney loves their live action remakes of their animated films. And the one thing that, no matter if you agree or disagree with live action remakes, the one thing that everyone wants is a live action remake of Atlantis the Lost Empire with Tom Holland and Zendaya as Milo and Kida Kagash. Now, the most famous live action Atlantis we have is that from DC film Aquaman and Aquaman the Lost Kingdom. It is actually the second character and version of Atlantis we have in comics. And the first, not so famous one, is that from Marvel, who had to change their version of Atlantis because DC already beat them to a film set in Atlantis. So Disney brought out Black Panther Wakanda Forever, and their Atlantis was renamed to Talokan, ruled by Kukulkan or Namor. And they, instead of going to European inspiration for the kingdom, they went with Mayan inspiration for Atlantis. Now, Jules Verne is one of my all-time favorite authors, and I consider myself to be a bit of a Vernian. And in his book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he helped bring Atlantis into the spotlight when Captain Nemo visited Atlantis with his Nautilus submarine. And we have the 2012 film Journey to the Mysterious Island, a film also based on Verne's books, this time Mysterious Island, but they made an incredible amount of changes. So instead of it being just the mysterious island from the beginning to the end, in the film they discover that the mysterious island in Jules Verne's book refers to Atlantis. The final one I would like to mention is the TV show Atlantis from the BBC about a submarine pilot washing up on the shores of Atlantis. Now that we know the pop culture, let's look at the primary source of Atlantis. And we get that from the 4th century Athenian philosopher Plato, who first set it down in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. And here he tells these stories as one heard from his grandfather, who had in turn heard it from the 6th century sage Solon, and Solon in his turn was said to have heard it from Egyptian priests Xenophus of Heliopolis and Sonchis of Sais. Now the next couple of slides are extracts from Timaeus and Critias, and it reads as follows. Many great and wonderful deeds are recorded of your state, Athens, in our histories. But one of them exceeds all the rest in greatness and valor. For these histories tell of a mighty power which unprovoked made an expedition against the whole of Europe and Asia, and to which your city put to an end. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in these days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, and was the way to other islands, and from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean, for which this sea is within the Straits of Heracles, i.e. the Mediterranean, is only a harbour, having a narrow entrance, but that other is a real sea, and the land surrounding it on every side may be most truly called a boundless continent. Now, in the island of Atlantis, it was a great and wonderful empire which had ruled over the whole island and several others, and over part of the continent, and furthermore, the men of Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Heracles, i.e. the Straits of Gibraltar, as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, or in Etruria in North Italy. This vast power gathered into one endeavored to subdue at a blow our country and yours, and the whole of the region within the straits, and then your country, Solon city-state of Athens, defeated and triumphed over the invaders, and preserved from slavery those who were not yet subjugated, and generously liberated all the rest of us who dwelt within the pillars. But afterwards here occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in the body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared into the depths of the sea. And in his second dialogue, Critias, Plato described this ill-fated island of Atlantis in considerably expanded detail. In shape, it was circular, with its focal points on an acropolis or hill where stood the royal palace, a marvel to behold for size and beauty, and notable for hot and cold water plumbing. Here there ruled kings who at certain prescribed times hunted bulls that were allowed to roam free in the temple precinct. These had to be captured without the aid of weapons, 10 sacrificed before a sacred pillar, after which there was feasting and then the passing of laws. During the law-giving, the kings would dress in special azure robes in the environs of the palace were temples for Atlantis' god Poseidon and his mistress Plato, after whose son Atlas the island received its name. Both temples were rich in gold, silver, ivory, and orichalcum. Walls and an inner harbour surrounded the central area, which there was a ring of land, then a second harbour, and a large outer circle of land, featuring a well-irrigated plain with mountains to the north. So this is basically what Atlantis would have looked like. According to Plato, Atlantis met its fate some 8,000 or 9,000 years before the time of Solon, who lived in 600 BC. Based on this information alone, many distinguished Victorian classical scholars dismissed the tale as nothing more than a piece of make-believe, a romantic pipe dream along the lines of Sir Thomas More's Utopia. Now, is Plato's story necessarily totally a piece of fiction? If its chronology and geographical settings are adhered to, then the answer is undoubtedly yes. Neither archaeological nor geographical evidence suggests Atlantis existed. But if it is accepted that the lost land may not have been in the Atlantic, but in another ocean or on another piece of land, and that it didn't happen 9,000 years ago before Solon, then there is some greater credence to the story, as at least the glimmering of a memory of a real event is possible. But where is Atlantis? In 1909, the Irish scholar Katie Frost suggested that the real Atlantis may have been the Minoan civilization of Crete, which undoubtedly suffered a sudden and rather mysterious eclipse about 1500 BC. According to Frost, there was more than likely a language barrier between the Greek Solon and the Egyptian priests from whom he heard the story. When they spoke of a great island far to the west, they, untraveled in the Mediterranean, may only have intended to mean somewhere as near as Crete, while Solon, whom Crete was on the doorstep of, may have assumed they must mean somewhere beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. Adding to the idea is the fact that the Egyptian name for the Cretans and their neighbors was Keftiu, which broadly means a people of the pillar, and among the Greeks, Atlas was the Titan who holds up the pillars of the sky, hence Atlantis, the land of Atlas, not to be confused with Plato's story. Another theory is that of Elike, a Greek city that was submerged by a tsunami in about 373 BC. Alfred Taylor and Percival Freudiger first suggested that the sudden and dramatic disappearance of Elike, destroyed by an earthquake and submerged in the sea, inspired Plato to devise the myth of Atlantis. As mentioned before, the story of Atlantis and its destruction first appeared in Plato's late dialogues to Timaeus and Critias, written only a few years after the destruction of Elike. Plato certainly knew about the catastrophe and may even have had a personal interest in it. In 388 BC, Plato had visited the court of Dionysios I of Syracuse, where he managed to offend the tyrant. According to Plutarch, Dionysios then asked Polus, a visiting Spartan admiral and ambassador, to do him a favor and get rid of Plato. Polus seized Plato, took him to the slave market on the island of Aegina, and put him up for sale. Diogenes Laertius says that Anaxagoras of Cyrene, who recognized Plato, purchased his freedom and sent him home. And 15 years later, Polus was drowned in the disaster at Elike. And Dionysius heard about it, and he really regarded this as a portent from the gods. Fearing for his own safety, Dionysius wrote to Plato asking the philosopher not to speak evil of him. Plato just replied that he had no time at all to think about Dionysius. The entire story looks suspiciously like propaganda, but it could have some basis in reality. Admiral Polus may well have drowned at Lycae, but we know from Elian's account that Spartan warships were anchored there on the night of the disaster. In 2001, Helike was found buried in the ancient lagoon near the village of Rizomelos. To further confirm that the discovered site belongs to Helike, the earthquake destruction layer consisting of cobblestone, clay roof tiles, and pottery was uncovered in 2012. This destruction layer is in good agreement with ancient texts on the location of Helike and the earthquakes that affected the city. Now, next up we have a book by Peter James titled The Sunken Kingdom. And in this book, he identifies Atlantis with the kingdom of Zapasla. He argues that Solon did indeed gather the story on his travels, but in Lydia and not Egypt, as Plato states, and that Atlantis is identical with Tantalus, the city of Tantalus in Asia Minor, which was in a similar tradition known to the Greeks, said to have been destroyed by an earthquake. That the legend of Atlantis' conquest in the Mediterranean is based on the revolution by King Mawduwatas of Zapasla against Hittite rule. That Zapasla is identical with Sipylus, where Greek tradition placed Tantalus, and that the now vanished lake to the north of Mount Sipylus was the site of the city. The last theory we'll look into is the Richet structure. The Richet structure had been the subject of fringe claims to be the site of Atlantis. The Eye of the Sahara is situated in the Western Sahara Desert in Mauritania. On the ground, it's about 40 kilometers across. It was first discovered in the 1930s, and it was originally thought to have been an impact crater. However, research in the 1950s and 1960s has since eliminated the possibility of it having been made by an extraterrestrial impact in favor of terrestrial causes. Eventually, scientists settled for a theory according to which it is a 100-million-year-old dome of molten rock, eroded and shaped by the wind and water. Now, there are so many theories on where Atlantis is located. Some of the honorable mentions is the Isle of Pharaohs, before Alexander the Great connected the island to mainland Egypt. Malta, inspired by discovery of Gantija and Flagarkim. The Black Sea. Pillars of Heracles are in the Strait of Bosporus, according to those sources. Azure Islands are the mountain tips of Atlantis, apparently. Canary, Madeira, and Cape Verde, and they are seen as remains of a broken up Atlantis. Britain, quite obscure one, but it is said that Little Sail Bank, a relatively shallow area, was the capital of Atlantis. And finally, Finland, where it is said that Atlantis is more of a period than a place, and that the word Atlantis comes from Outland is, meaning all land ice, aka the Ice Age. Now, does Atlantis truly exist? Absolutely not. No way, Jose. It is fake. But do I believe in it in any way? Undoubtedly, yes. Why not? It keeps parts of my childhood alive. And I will therefore end off this lecture with a song with an extract from a song titled We Are, and it states, that legendary place that the end of the map reveals is only legendary until someone proves it real. Thank you very much.